The IPS Academy provides online courses from some of the best instructors out there on mental health, personal development, lifestyle, nutrition, relationships, mindfulness, improving your life quality, etc. Each course we offer has been made in collaboration with an instructor who has also been a guest here on the Inner Picture Stories podcast. Have a look to see if there's a course to your liking, read the full course descriptions, and check out the thousands of positive reviews from students who have taken the course by going to innerpicturestories.com/academy. With that, let's dig into the interview. Welcome to the Inner Picture Stories podcast. My name is Jellis Vaas, your host and the founder of Inner Picture Stories, the educational platform on life. I hereby invite you to come on a journey with me. In each episode, we will dive into the life of an inspiring person seeking lessons of wisdom about life and the world we live in. Answers that you can take away and use in your own life. It's true that no one ever said life would be easy, but it's also true that no one ever said you had to do it alone. So get ready and let the journey begin.
There is hope. There's a lot of hope that you will get better. Most people do get better. They improve. Are you going to forget what happened? Probably not, but you're going to be able to manage and deal with it in a much healthier way. There's a saying in the trauma field, the trauma, it's what's happened to you, right? It's not you, it's what's happened to you. It's this thing that's happened to you that is what's caused this. There's, I think, value in that because it allows you to separate yourself from the experience.
This is episode 019 with Dr. Guy Macpherson. A warm welcome everyone to a new episode of the Inner Picture Stories podcast. This interview was such an interesting one to do. The topic that is being covered in this episode is psychological trauma. Such a multi-layered topic with so many complexities and fascinations to it. In my search to find a suitable person for this interview, I came across Guy Macpherson, Ph.D., a doctorate in clinical psychology, founder of the Traumatized project, which is a platform where a guy provides resources and a community for clinicians and therapists of all kinds who are starting out on their trauma-informed journey. And he is also the host of the Traumatized podcast, where a guy talks with world-renowned thought leaders about trauma and various other health professionals. There really isn't a better person for this interview than Guy to provide a strong base understanding of trauma, ways to start the healing process, and how to be supportive to someone who is suffering from a trauma. Now, while many of the questions you might have about trauma will be answered in this interview, as I state, trauma is complicated. Each answer to one question might lead to another question. Therefore, I highly recommend you check out the Traumatized podcast, where, as I've said, Guy talks with world-renowned thought leaders about trauma and various other health professionals. Many other questions you might have around trauma will certainly be touched upon and answered there. It's startling to know how many people walk around with an unhealed trauma or even traumas from their past. Or as Guy points out in the interview, many people walk around not even realizing they have been traumatized in their past and are suffering from it. I sincerely hope this interview will provide you with many answers. Guy provides some great advice and practical takeaways. Do as well check out the show notes, which are in the description of this episode, or can be found by going directly to innerpicturestories.com/podcast and search for Guy. There you will find all the resources, book recommendations, and people that are being talked about, all linked up for you. As well, you may find some additional helpful information in the show notes on trauma. Now, with all that, please enjoy this most fascinating conversation with Dr. Guy Macpherson about psychological trauma. Guy, a warm welcome here to the show. And thank you for taking the time. I truly appreciate it.
Oh, man, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk to you.
You struck me as an incredible guest to have here on the podcast to talk about trauma because of various reasons. Your education as a clinical psychologist, your personal experience with trauma, which we will touch upon soon, and of course the work you're doing with the Trauma Therapist Project, where you help educate other trauma workers and provide a community to them. And of course the podcast you have, the Trauma Therapist Podcast, where you have interviewed over more than plus 350 health professionals and leading figures in trauma to provide information and spread awareness of trauma. And plus 350 guests. That's, by the way, an incredible number of guests you've had on your podcast. How has this experience been for you to talk to so many interesting people over the years?
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Just want to make one clarification. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I have a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. So I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, but I'm not a licensed therapist. I was doing therapy under a licensed clinician for a period of time, but just wanted to make that clarification. But yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, it's as you know, Yellis, interviewing people, it's really informative. It's really inspiring. And if you love what you're doing, like I do, and I'm sure you do too, it just keeps you going. It's like this hand reaches into your gut and shakes you and inspires you. I get inspired, when I talk to my guests. I just get so fired up because really yes, my podcast is about trauma, but really on the podcast, I kind of reach my hands in to the hearts of my guests and find out, how the hell did they get into this field? And that just ignites me. So in short, I just get fired up.
Yeah, I totally get it. When did you actually start with the podcast?
I started about, I think 3.5 years ago or so. Yeah. And that, why I started it is a whole other thing we can get into if you want. But just to answer your question, about 3.5 years ago.
Cool. So trauma it's a fascinating topic, and fascinating in how complex it is, but as well in how many people walk around with an unhealed trauma from their past. And the more I researched about trauma for this interview, the more and more questions I came to have. There is honestly so much to this topic. Now, for the sake of the length of this episode and to not keep you here the whole day, I want to focus specifically in this episode on providing a general understanding of trauma and ways for listeners to start the healing process. So I like to start this interview off with maybe some rather basic sounding questions about trauma. However, these questions will come to set a base understanding for everyone, and before we move deeper then. So first of all, what is trauma? How would you define and explain to someone what trauma is?
Yeah, and let me just jump back to what you said before I answer this question. You said there are a lot of people walking around with unhealed trauma, and that is certainly true. But alongside that, there are a lot of people walking around with unrecognized trauma, right? They don't even know they've been traumatized in the first place. So, which kind of segues into a definition of trauma. And this can be defined a lot of different ways. A lot of people think of trauma as being, synonymous with war trauma or combat trauma, specifically PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone's been in combat and they step on an IED or a bomb and they come back with post-traumatic stress disorder and flashbacks and numbing and so forth. And certainly that is trauma. But when you talk about trauma, can also be defined as it's defined as something that disrupts or completely dysregulates one's nervous system, and therefore it just kind of sets them on high alert all the time, or completely numbs them out or depresses them. It's something that dysregulates our nervous system to the degree that we can no longer function in a healthy or normal way. I'll use myself as an example. When I was really young, I was bullied. And that situation, Yellis, just like completely shifted the trajectory of how I was in relationships, my self-esteem, my self-confidence, what I thought about myself. And oftentimes, a lot of people don't think of that as something that could be traumatizing. Granted, it's not going to be traumatizing for everybody. That's another thing here that's, I think, really important to point out, is just because you don't think something's traumatizing for someone, right? Someone else might be bullied and they might not be traumatized by it, but some other people might be. Some other people are going to go to war and they're going to have certain really intense experiences and they might not be traumatized by them. And that's the way it goes. And there are reasons for that, but it's really important for people to understand that what can be traumatizing for one person might not be traumatizing for someone else. Mm-hmm. I mean, interpersonal trauma, there are different kind of categories of trauma. We talked about like war trauma or PTSD that people get from war. There are traumas that come from, experiencing earthquakes or car crashes or being in tornadoes and fires. And there's something called complex trauma or interpersonal trauma that comes from being abused, sometimes from years of abuse, right? From family members or friends, or sexual trauma like rape. So unfortunately, there's a crazy amount of the type of trauma out there. And like you said earlier on, a lot of times people are walking around not realizing that they've been traumatized, not recognizing the fact that when they were really young, they had a certain experience. Maybe they were touched in a particular way that wasn't right, that they were violated. They might not realize that has impacted how they're showing up in relationships now.
So we all react to trauma in different ways, experiencing a wide range of physical and emotional reactions. However, are there some clear symptoms you can say, Guy, people may experience right after a traumatic event? Or to put this question maybe differently, how do you know that you've been traumatized by an event?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. And I guess the first question would be, has there been an event that could be traumatizing? So, if you were in a car crash, oftentimes there's something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which happens after like 6 months, but there's also something that happens directly after that event, which is called acute stress disorder. So, for example, someone who's maybe in a car crash, the next day they might feel just on hyper alert or hyper vigilant. They might be having flashbacks. They might be feeling depressed or anxious. Things that kind of disrupt the normal day-to-day state, the normal day-to-day living, are oftentimes a sign that you may have been traumatized. For example, and I think this is really interesting, oftentimes when younger kids, 15, 16, 12, younger kids, their reaction to trauma oftentimes is depression. A depressed state. That's how it often shows up. It doesn't show up like in these oftentimes classic symptoms of, like hypervigilance or numbing that we oftentimes see with post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's what's interesting here, to get to the heart of your question here, it can show up differently for a lot of different people. But again, I think what's important to think about is, has there been an event that may or may not have been traumatizing? And B, has there been a shift in your behavior or the way you're feeling or the way you're interacting with people? That could be a sign of having been traumatized. And you think, look at me, like I talked about being bullied when I was like 11, 12, or 13 years old. And now that shows up and can show up. I mean, to a lesser degree, it shows up now because I've been through a lot of therapy and I've quote unquote dealt with it or danced with it, if you will, it shows up how I am in relationships, what I do, what I don't do, what's important to me, how I respond and react to my wife and even my kids. So the things I pay attention to and don't pay attention to. So yeah, you got me going, Yellis.
Good, keep going. It's all great things that you're actually saying. So again, this might be a very simple sounding question, but what could be the long-term dangers when someone does not heal their trauma?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And, I mean, it can be different, obviously, for a lot of different people, but an example, and it depends on what that trauma was. Let's take interpersonal trauma. If people don't show up or don't recognize that they have been impacted by trauma, oftentimes what happens is, again, the nervous system is dysregulated. What does that mean? That means that people can start to become anxious when they shouldn't be, or they can, when it's not adaptive, when it's not helpful. They can be hypervigilant when, again, it's not adaptive or helpful. They can start to feel out of place. And oftentimes what happens is people start needing to regulate their nervous system. So what do they turn to? They turn to drugs. They turn to alcohol. They turn to sex. They turn to any number of things. And you talk to people in the field like Gabor Mate, the physician who really specializes in addiction, and he says that all addiction really at the heart, at the source of addiction, there's trauma. So oftentimes people become addicted to things to help themselves, to help themselves manage their feeling states or emotional states that they might not know began with trauma. So, and then you talk about, it also can manifest itself in a series of unhealthy relationships, where people need to get the love they didn't get, right, from their parents, and they try to get this in many different ways. I mean, the answers here are endless. You talk about people who have been veterans of war who have been traumatized, who have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe who don't recognize it, right? And they start to become depressed, and they start to drink. They start to turn to drugs. They start to get into negative, violent interactions with their family, with their kids. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and unhealed trauma is disastrous in the long run. It always comes up again, and you can keep numbing it through alcohol and drugs and all that, but it will keep coming up if you don't heal it. One thing more that I'd love you to clarify before we'll move deeper here with trauma. Could you explain what the difference is between trauma and PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder? Because I think there's a bit of confusion and unclarity for many people what the difference is.
Yeah, and it depends who you talk to too. I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder is something that, is a diagnosis that is in the DSM, the Psychiatric Manual of Disorders, that is a reference guide. Now, this could be a whole other podcast episode, but there are those who feel that, that's completely hogwash. I mean, and there are other people who feel like, well, it's useful. It's a helpful compendium of diagnoses that people can go to for reference. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis that has certain qualifications, or, for example, a hypervigilance is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Numbing is a symptom. So there are certain symptoms that come from that. And if you look at the name post-traumatic stress disorder, so it's a diagnosis or symptoms, a collection of symptoms that come directly after a traumatic event. namely, let's say, for example, a car crash or experiencing an earthquake or some kind of other natural or sexual assault or rape. Trauma is a broader term, and it kind of helps to think of it in terms of being on a continuum. On the left end, you might have mild trauma, and then the far end, all the way on the right, you might have post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. But within that continuum, there is a level of dysfunction or dysregulation, rather, of the nervous system, of the body, of the neurobiology of a system, where, for example, if someone is involved, again, in interpersonal trauma over the course of months or even years, what that does, and depending on how old that person is, let's say a younger kid, maybe even saying a younger kid who hasn't even reached puberty, right? What happens when someone experiences that type of trauma, it completely dysregulates, again, their nervous system, their hormones, and sets them off on a course of experiencing symptoms that they're not even ready for, that they can't even recognize. So trauma falls in kind of those categories, if that makes sense.
It does. So with those questions answered, I think we've set a good stage to delve a bit deeper now. I'd first like to move, if you don't mind, of course, Guy, to your personal experience with trauma. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it, Yellis. Thank you for having me here and talking about this stuff.
So, yeah, in my research about you, I read your brother, who is a Navy SEAL veteran, suffered from PTSD. What was it like back then to experience this? To see someone you love dearly and that you care about suffer from PTSD?
Yeah, well, that was an interesting story. I mean, when my brother came back, I didn't know that much about trauma. I mean, so what happened was he came back from his experiences and his I was going to say Iraq, but I don't know if it was Iraq specifically that he came back from. But when he got back, I was so excited to talk to him, Yellis, because we hadn't seen him for a long time.
Sure.
And I didn't understand that, when he didn't want to talk about stuff, I thought it was blowing me off. He was like, Guy, I just don't want to talk. I thought it was ridiculous. What do you mean you don't want to talk about stuff? Right? I didn't get that I was trying to push him too hard, that it just was too difficult for him to talk about. He didn't want to talk about it. It wasn't something that someone should be pressured to talk about. And yet here I was, not really knowing anything, certainly not as much as I do now, about trauma and PTSD. Here I was pushing him for this. And then when I found out later on, when I went to school and so forth, I felt like, I felt so bad for myself. For him, and I felt ashamed of myself for trying to, push him and pressure him into talking about this stuff. But fortunately, he got better. He worked through stuff, and it definitely cost him a marriage. And yeah, he left a lot of destruction in his wake. And it was intense.
Sure. How has this experience actually changed and impacted you?
It's given me. It was certainly one of the things that inspired me to start what I'm doing, to start the Trauma Therapist Project, to start the podcast, to have a whole series of interviews, titled the Military Series, where I interview people who work specifically with veterans, be they just civilians or veterans turned therapists who now work with veterans. So it's really given me an interest and a cause to highlight their work and to celebrate their work, because it's crazy to me that here you have this whole segment of the population, veterans, who come back from their experience and who oftentimes, not all, but a chunk of them, right? A chunk of them are killing themselves. And a chunk of them are coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's shameful to admit. it's shameful to talk about.
Yeah. Being a professional trauma therapist and having interviewed more than plus 350 of people on your podcasts, what do you wish you knew back then that you know today that would have greatly come to help you, to help your brother with his recovery and healing? So basically, what pieces of advice would you recommend to listeners to be of support to someone who has gone through something traumatic and is suffering from this?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I think for me, it would have been the realization that he needed to work through things on his own timeline, number one. Number two, not to pressure him into talking about his experiences. And number three, to really know where to guide him to get some help. And just to be supportive, because it's really interesting with people who are veterans. I mean, they need to do their work, right? Let me rephrase that. What they need to do their work, what they need to do their job, what they need to survive is very different than what they need to survive when they come back, right? So in other words, to admit that they might have PTSD could be helpful for them when they get back, and if they do have PTSD, but it's not really necessarily going to help them when they're there. And it's that type of understanding, and I certainly didn't have that when my brother came back.
And possibly you probably experienced this firsthand with your brother, but often shame and trauma are strongly connected. How come trauma survivors often feel this deep sense of shame for this experience that happened to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, the first thing that came to my mind is when let's talk about interpersonal trauma, complex trauma, people who are being abused. Oftentimes young kids feel that they've done something to cause it, right? So there's a lot of shame in that. Oftentimes,
that they're at fault.
Right, that they're at fault, that they somehow, quote unquote, led on the perpetrator. Oftentimes when people are young kids are sexually abused, there's a kind of almost like a natural excitement that comes along with that, and people feel shamed in that. That doesn't mean that you want that sexual encounter to happen. There's a lot of shame in that. I mean, when people are, men or women, they're raped, oftentimes there's shame in admitting that. There's, I mean, this is crazy. You have a whole segment of men who've been raped. I mean, men don't want to admit that that's happened to them, right? I mean, nor do women, of course. But it's just, shame is rampant. It's almost synonymous with being traumatized. And look at veterans, right? If you're a veteran, if you've been in combat and you've been traumatized, there's almost like a weakness in admitting you have PTSD. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's often exactly like feeling a certain weakness that kind of creates that shame.
Right. And even with myself, being bullied, here I am, an adult male talking about being bullied when I was younger. I mean, it took me a while to get over that, a while to be comfortable with even admitting that, So and that, of course, interferes with recognizing that it's happened in the first place and then getting help in the second place.
How do you feel about that today, actually, to talk about being bullied back in the day?
I mean, I feel okay talking about it. I mean, it still, bothers me that it happened. I don't get as triggered by it now than I used to get. It doesn't negatively impact me as much as it does. But I can certainly see, like I referred to before, how it really impacted different aspects of my life.
Yeah. So something quite interesting that a lot of people might not know is that stressful and traumatic events leave imprints in our bodies. And there's an incredible book titled The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who is a well-respected expert on trauma, and someone you had as well on your podcast, who talks thoroughly about this in his book. Words alone are often not enough to heal trauma. The body is often the reason why people can't move past their trauma. And the following question that I have is more of a two-part question. So first of all, how come trauma remains stuck in so many people, their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, trauma impacts. Peter Levine is another kind of prominent researcher and therapist. And his initial work was looking at how animals dealt with their trauma. And what he found out was oftentimes when animals get into a fight or they become traumatized, what they do is either they kind of submit, they lay there, or they kind of just like run off, they run away. They're able to just get that energy, that adrenaline, those hormones that just raise up. They're able to get that, expel that out of their body. We as human beings don't necessarily do that. Oftentimes we freeze, we submit. That trauma that completely, again, dysregulates our nervous system, the hormones in our body just raise up. That is stored in our muscles. That is stored in our brain in such a way that we associate a certain event with a certain feeling. And that's what happens when people become triggered. That's what happens when, for example, veterans, when they come back and they hear a car backfire, or it's the 4th of July here in the United States and they hear firecrackers, and they go back, they have a flashback. That event, that sound has been associated, has been blended and melded with that particular feeling state in their body, and it sends them right back. And that's why oftentimes words aren't just enough to help someone heal through trauma. It has to be working through and becoming acquainted with the varying states, the uncomfortable states of the body, and understanding that they're no longer in danger, they're no longer a threat, and moving through that.
Mm-hmm. And so secondly, on that, how do you detoxify the body from trauma? Like what are ways to release this stress out of your body in a healthy way?
I think, again, it depends what the trauma is, what the stress is. If someone is, first of all, working with a therapist who is experienced in trauma is going to be paramount, and not all therapists are. So if someone out there is listening to this and they've been traumatized, finding someone who really specializes in this type of treatment is going to be helpful. And what that person is going to do is to first and foremost establish an environment of safety, an environment of trust.
Right.
Anyone who is kind of worth their weight in salt is not going to make you or even invite you to talk about your trauma right off the bat. Rather, they're going to let you work through that at your own pace. And what that means is, first and foremost, resourcing yourself. In other words, where are your strengths? Being aware of the strengths that you have, so that as you move through this, as your body moves through this trauma experience again, to understand that you do have strengths. So it's a slow process of becoming acquainted with the traumatic experiences in your body and understanding that even though they're happening now, you're in a safe spot, you're in a safe place, and understanding how to manage that. And that's done in a way that it is a very slow process. And there are different ways to do this too. There's somatic therapy, there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a way of working with the brain, and that's also been slowly integrated in with veterans and so forth. There are a lot of ways to do this, and another thing that the therapist is going to do is find out what's the best way for you.
Right. Yes. What other pieces of advice would you give to those who have gone through a traumatic event in the past and are trying to take steps to heal this wound? What actions, steps, practices, or exercises could you recommend to them to start the healing process of their trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question too, and I think one of the most important thing is to realize that there is hope. There's a lot of hope that you will get better. Most people do get better. They improve. Are you going to forget what happened? Probably not, but you're going to be able to manage and deal with it in a much healthier way. And that's the important thing, right? Not to be kind of thrown out of your quote unquote normal or healthy state of being such that you have to turn to alcohol or drugs, or sex or whatever, but to be able to manage it and to be able to recognize it. And I think that's one of the most important things. A lot of people feel that, they've been traumatized. They don't know what the hell is going on, and there's no hope. They're never going to get better. This takes time for people, but to find a therapist who specialize in this. Find groups of people. Online there are a lot of resources for people who've been traumatized, for survivors, for veterans who've experienced trauma, and I think that's a really important piece. I mean, that's so important that there is hope, and it's not. There's a saying in the trauma field that it's not. The trauma, it's what's happened to you, right? It's not you, it's what's happened to you. It's this thing that's happened to you that is what's caused this. And there's, I think, value in that because it allows you to separate yourself from the experience.
Yeah. So like with your personal experience then of being bullied in the past, how did you know when you were starting to heal this trauma that you were actually healing the roots of it?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I knew it when I would think about it and I didn't get as pissed off.
Okay.
Because I would get pissed off. I would get angry. I would feel it in my body.
So something would trigger that feeling.
Yeah. And just for an example, when I was working, before I went full time with the Trauma Therapist Project and the podcast, I was working in a clinic for 5 years. I was working with kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. And I was fresh out of graduate school. I was working in this clinic. And when I would sit down with kids and kids who'd been bullied, right? Something shifted in me. That became really important for me. That topic became important to me. And the problem there, Yellis, is that it became important to me. It wasn't necessarily important to them, right? And that's where you've got to be really careful. And that's where this whole topic of inner work comes in for the therapists and clinicians out there. You've got to do your own inner work. So to answer your question in a different way, I became very conscious of that. And the more conscious I became of that, the more I realized that I was healing from that. I was healing that trauma.
So it's often hard to start this recovery journey all by yourself. It's therefore also that one of the best ways to start the healing process is through the help of a trained professional. Guy, do you have any, from all your experiences of working with trauma and all the health professionals you've interviewed, do you have any pieces of advice for listeners on how to find a good therapist and what to pay attention to know that you're going to the right therapist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so much of this, Yellis, it's a process. Oftentimes people get really discouraged because they go to a therapist and it doesn't work out. It just doesn't work out. But you can't give up. You've got to. It's a fit. You've got to find that person who fits with you, and you will. But don't stop. Number one. Number two, trust your gut. If you don't feel it, it doesn't click, don't continue. There's no shame in that. There's no harm in that. Find someone who is experienced, who specializes in trauma, who's had education in trauma and in your particular experience with trauma. If you're a veteran and you've been to war and you've been to combat and you have PTSD, find someone who's worked in that particular field. But don't give up. It's not that all therapists suck. It's that you have to find the therapist who's going to work with you and for you and is going to be a good fit. It's unlike a relationship, right? You've got to find that person that's going to be a good fit for you.
Right. You got to date a little bit around before knowing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you might find that right off the bat, you might find that person, sure. Right? But there is someone out there who wants to work with you because, look, the people who are in this field are dedicated. Trauma sucks. It does. And the people who are working in this field are really dedicated to helping and walking alongside people who've been impacted by trauma along that healing journey. And you just got to find that person. You will find that person.
Mm-hmm. So trust your gut. You said that's definitely important.
Huge.
Is there anything more on that, like of what to pay attention to just be aware that you're maybe not, that you're not in front of the right therapist?
Yeah, I think, if it doesn't feel right, don't move forward with it. Don't go back just because you think, oh, I've got to see a therapist, let me go back. No, find someone that just clicks with you. I mean, I think that's all I can say, but honor that because it's easy not to. It's easy to just get in your head and think, oh, this person has this degree or they've done that and they've done that, and maybe there's something wrong with me. Just throw that all out the window, and this is all about relationship. It's all about rapport. It's all about trust. And yes, the person has to have that experience, but honor what's going on for you.
Yeah, and as you said, it's about that you feel safe, right?
Right, and you can trust, mm-hmm. and you can try, and you feel like you have a good rapport with that person. There's an interesting thing about safety in this field, in this topic, because safety oftentimes is set, but it's oftentimes under the umbrella. It's kind of the umbrella under which a lot of trauma happens, right? A lot of kids think they're safe, and yet they're being traumatized. So safety is kind of a double-edged sword, and trust might be more important here, right? So I just want to put that out there. This is multifaceted topic, and it's hard to just have one word out there that people can go with. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that's a very helpful piece of advice, actually. Guy, I could literally keep throwing questions at you. So I just have 3 more remaining questions before we will start to round up this interview. So from your podcast, the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and I know this might be a difficult question, because there's so many episodes, but do you have a few good starting episodes, or in general, any favorite episodes of yours that you could recommend listeners to check out?
Yeah. One of the ones that really inspired me was an early one I did with Gerald Vest. He's no longer around. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he actually worked with veterans. I mean, and this guy you listen to him talk, and he was just so passionate about helping these guys. And I say these guys, these men and women, and it just was like blew me away. It was so inspiring to me. There's another one I did with a psychologist by the name of Peter Bernstein, who's a guy who grew up in this hard environment, and he never thought he was smart enough to get into college, and let alone be a psychologist. And his story, Yellis, he talks about his story and how he moved through this journey of self-recognition and realization into the work he's doing now. Actually, ironically enough, helping veterans is so inspiring. And I mean, I've done so many episodes with people who, you talked about Bessel van der Kolk. Yeah, he's world renowned, but I've done so many more with people who aren't well known, but who are just so inspiring, and they talking about their journey and what inspires them to do this work. Anyway, those are two really good starting points. Another one I've done recently with Sarah Payton is she talks a lot about the different ways we use language to understand trauma. We talked about how language, words aren't enough, but oftentimes words can be that entry point as well. Anyway, so those are a few that I've really enjoyed.
Awesome. So for everyone listening, I will link that up in the show notes. Besides your own podcasts, are there any other resources as books, YouTube videos, websites, etc. you feel listeners could greatly benefit from to learn more about trauma?
To learn more about trauma, man, I think we talked about Peter Levine, his book, the book you mentioned, The Body Keeps a Score, would probably be a phenomenal book to start with. It's kind of a popular book, if you will, and a really good one and an inspiring book. I think that would be probably the perfect place to start there.
Okay, great. So I'll also link that one up in the show notes. The last question that I have for you, Guy, do you feel that there is something big I still left out about trauma, or was there any questions you'd hoped I asked but didn't ask that you still would like to touch upon, or do you feel like we covered it pretty much?
I think you hit it. I think what I would like to reiterate, though, is that, we kind of made a distinction between people who are walking around with unhealed trauma and people who might not even recognize that they do have trauma. I just want to reiterate that if people feel that there's something off, or they feel that an experience kind of impacted them in a particular way, I'm not saying it is trauma, but it might have been. And if people feel like maybe they were traumatized, to maybe explore that a little more and to not be ashamed or to feel ashamed, and maybe to seek out help, number one. And number two is to know that there is hope, that people get better from who've experienced all types of trauma. People do get better. There you go.
Great. Guy, with that last question, I'd like to thank you for doing the work that you're doing with the Trauma Therapist Project. It's incredible work that you're doing with it. And of course, for coming here on the show and to provide this greater understanding about trauma to everyone. So before we finish this interview, there's one final end question that I ask all my guests. But before I do that, what is the best place for people to check out your work and to connect with you, Guy?
Yep. The best place is the traumatherapistproject.com. My podcast is up there. My membership community is up there. And my contact information is up there. So the traumatherapistproject.com.
Awesome. So I'll link that up in the show notes for everyone. So the final question, and you can make it as long or as short as you want, but from everything that you have seen, experienced, lived, and learned in your life, what is the one thing you know to be true?
Oh man, Yellis. The one thing I know to be true is there is a world of strength, power, and beauty in trusting and believing in who we are. And that's not always easy. And it certainly hasn't been and isn't always easy for me. But to, and in part, a large part, I think my life has been a journey of uncovering that, reaching in. I talked about my reaching into my guest's gut and like finding out who they are, for me, that's been my truth. That's been my journey. And to believe in that, because that is the beauty. And we're all different, right? But I think when we trust that, when we believe that, when we see people who are living their truth, their own beauty, we're attracted to that. We're mesmerized by that. They're like these beams of light. And that to me has not always come easy, but that to me, I believe to be true.
That's a beautiful way to end this episode here. Guy, thank you again for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
All right, brother. Thanks so much.
And there we have it. That concludes yet another episode here on the Inner Picture Stories podcast. Do check out the show notes located in the description of this episode or by going directly to innerpicturestories.com/podcast and search for Guy. There you can find all the resources, people and book recommendations that were mentioned in this episode by Guy, as well as additional helpful information on psychological trauma. Again, as I already stated at the beginning of this episode, I'd highly recommend you also check out the Trauma Therapist Project. If you'd like to learn even more about trauma, it's an incredible source of valid information from many professionals around the subject of trauma. If you're looking for any more answers, you will certainly find them there. With that, thank you for spending time here on the podcast with Guy and me. I wish you nothing but a pleasant day out there. I hope to see you on another episode, another journey here on the Inner Picture Stories podcast. This is your host, Jelis Faus, signing off.